Meetings are a product. Meetings are the most important product in our entire organization.
Welcome to ThoughtSparks. Like, subscribe, comment, share, and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Rita McGrath here with another edition of the ThoughtSparks podcast. My guest this week is someone I've been really looking forward to talking to. It's Rebecca Hinds, who is the author of this terrific book. For many of you, I know you spend, an inordinate amount of time in soul-sucking meetings. Get this book. It's awesome. So Rebecca, welcome. Rebecca's a lecturer at Stanford, a multiple entrepreneur founder, and just all around expert on the use of time and how we can make it more productive.
Thank you so much for having me, Rita.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. So let's start with the sort of journey. How did you get started and come to be writing a book on soul-sucking meetings, or rather the inverse, I guess, of soul-sucking meetings?
It's been a long journey, certainly. I grew up as an athlete. I was a competitive swimmer and have always been fascinated by the science of teamwork. And in particular, I'm originally from Toronto, Canada. I came to the US to swim at Stanford, a very elite athletic program. And I saw the magic of teamwork firsthand. And I became fascinated by the idea that you could bring together a group of people from all over the world and create an environment that extracted the best out of every person in athletics. And as I was transitioning from a career of athletics to academics and industry, I started to think carefully and do a lot of research on, how might we create that type of environment in an organizational setting? And what do we know about the highest performing teams and organizations? And became very fascinated by collaboration, network science, coordination, and meetings in so many ways are the tip of the iceberg. They're rarely the root problem, but everyone has this visceral negative reaction to meetings. And I wanted to do more than just create a series of tips and tricks, and wanted to think about how might we create a fuller solution in terms of a blueprint for better meetings.
And I think it's a really refreshing take because, a lot of the things about meetings are we kind of fall into them. They're not, nobody intends them to be horrible things. But I remember years ago, I was working for a large industrial, with a large industrial company. And I remember coming into the building, and it was about, call it 8:30, 9 o'clock. And there were literally 30 people around this massive conference room. And I remember going to get coffee, and it was about 9:30, and the same 30 people were there. And then I came back about 10 o'clock, and the same 30 people were there. And then we broke for lunch, and they were just breaking up from this all morning meeting, and nobody looked happy.
And you've hit the nail on the head in terms of, so often we use meetings as our lazy default solution to everything. Any sort of uncertainty, any sort of problem, we have this knee-jerk reaction for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest ones is meetings are very visible within the organization. You can see, as you did, people in a conference room huddled around. You can often see people's calendars on the computer screen, publicly available in organizations. And meetings have become a status symbol as well. You see those people in the meeting, and especially depending on where they're sitting and who's speaking, tells a lot about the dynamics of the company and who has power and who has the most power within the organization or the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was this piece in, I think it was in the New York Times, not too long ago, that was co-authored by one of my colleagues, former colleagues at Wharton, at Adam Grant and his colleagues. And they were talking about why is it that so many bosses want everybody back in the office? And it wasn't about productivity, and it wasn't about, team building, and it wasn't about, no, they want them back in the office so they can be the, most important man on campus. So the desire to have people back in the office was strongly correlated with narcissism in their study, which I thought was both highly hilarious and also pretty damning, right?
Yes, I love that study. I think it's gonna, because so much of not just meetings, but so much of how we work is rooted in opinion, evidence, where, what the boss thinks and believes, even the location of the headquarters. We think about all of these aspects of our organizations that are highly, highly driven by
Mhm.
status dynamics. And
Absolutely.
meetings are certainly no exception. And in many ways, they're the most visible form of some of these manifestations of status and power within the organization.
Oh, totally. Oh, totally. And we've all been in them where like the boss says blue and everybody's like blue is awesome, blue's amazing. And part of the dilemma to me for leaders is that it stops being possible to get honest feedback if you allow that kind of meeting to to be the way that you primarily connect with your people. You just don't get the information you need to make informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. And, idea quality suffers as well. There's research in the book and other places on brainstorming and how that, can be significantly negatively impacted if you have powerful people in the room, even if they are very well intentioned and
Oh yeah.
are soliciting input. We have these natural human biases where meetings are often not the best way to accomplish a certain goal, especially at a certain point within the creative brainstorming cycle.
Yeah, Ed Catmull used to say very famously that he would never allow Steve Jobs to come into his,
Yes.
high-level brainstorming meetings about what was going on at Pixar because he just was
Mm-hmm.
afraid it would distort the dynamics. So back to
Mm-hmm.
the book, you talk about the design of meetings, and you very specifically name it as a design problem, and talk about 7 principles. So maybe walk us through a couple of those principles and where do I start?
Sure. So, and that's the premise of the book, that meetings are a product. Meetings are the most important product in our entire organization, right? They're where decisions get made, culture often gets built or broken, alignment gets set. And yet, so often, they're the least optimized product in our entire organization, right? And when we think about the products and services that we would launch to customers and feel comfortable launching to customers, right? There's a lot of design, there's a lot of feedback, a lot of refinement. We would never ship a meeting to a customer the way we ship meetings to our employees, and uh, it's not rocket science in many ways. I mean, certainly there's different levels of meeting effectiveness and hygiene, in particular when we think about AI. But at the core of it, they are design principles that we know make everyday products great. How can we apply them to meetings? The first is my favorite. It's also the most radical. It's around, how do we cut our meeting debt? Just as we have technical debt in product development, well, we have meeting debt where we have legacy meetings that build up on our calendar. We overschedule. We feel much more comfortable adding meetings to the calendar than removing them. And so, how do we think about cleaning the slate when things have gotten really bad? So, my favorite strategy is what I call a meeting doomsday.
I love
This
that.
is it's a 48-hour calendar cleanse, and consistently I see, if your meeting debt has gotten out of control, as it has in many organizations, in particular, large, complex, legacy type organizations, often a meeting doomsday, a 48-hour cleanse, employees do the cleaning, which is different than a lot of other, calendar cleanse interventions, and then rebuild the calendar from scratch.
I love that. I love that. I often find that, well, and part of this has to do with organization design, right? So if you think about the transition that we're in, and I talk a lot about, we're going from this mass production schema, if you will, this way of
Mm-hmm.
organizing things that really were, let's make a million identical widgets and sell them to a mass market. And we're moving to this world, which is much more digital, much more bespoke, where you've got services replacing products, where it's not mass production anymore. And yet we still organize in this way that sort of is hierarchical, and you've got all these different departments and everybody's tightly coupled. And so if you need the cooperation of 12 other units to get something done, it's it's nearly impossible to do it without some kind of coordination meetings. And so one of the things I've been exploring is how do we create looser coupling between groups so that we don't have to have these incredible coordination meetings all the time, right? So we've got the meeting Doomsday, cleanse the calendar.
Mhm.
You also
Yes.
talk about a concept called return on time invested, which is something I've used, but more at a strategy organizational level. I think you intend it more at
Mm.
an individual level.
Yes, and this is in the chapter around metrics, right? We know that metrics are very important in our organization, and so often we don't measure our meetings. We put them on the calendar, they finish, and that's it. There's no sort of feedback loop as we would have with great products. And so return on time investment is a simple two-part question. It can be one part, but there's two parts I recommend. After about 10% of the meetings you organize, ask attendees, who are the customers, was this worth the time you invested on a scale of 0 to 5? Right? As a follow up, what could I do as the meeting organizer that would boost your rating by 1 point? It gives you a ton of feedback, right? It's 3 to 4 minutes max. It's done anonymously. Now you can do it through technology in a way that's even less weight for both the organizer and attendees. And it gives you a lot of information. In particular, I often see organizers come out of that evaluation and recognize, wow, there's split ratings, right? This meeting was very helpful to a subset of employees. They rated the meeting 4 or 5 on that ROTI scale. But for other subset, they're rating the meetings 0 or 1 or 2. In that case, you've gotten very valuable information in terms of, okay, who actually needs to be in the room, or how should I better design the meeting so that those people who are rating the meeting zeros, ones, and twos feel like it's a better investment of their time.
Or why do they need to be there at all?
Yes, exactly.
In many organizations, there's this radical idea that, if you're at a meeting and you don't feel you're contributing, or you don't feel your input is really necessary, leave. And there's no judgment. It's just, this is not a useful way to spend my time. So I'm out of here. And I think that's why can't we have more of that? I think especially things like faculty meetings at universities. I'm sure you sat in on more than your fair share of those. Talk about, the agenda's the same, meeting to meeting to meeting. You stick some poor hapless assistant professor with taking the minutes. You go through this mind-numbing set of things, which are really, really difficult. So and I think when I think of the faculty meetings I've been involved with, they kind of violate your, what do you call them, 4Ds? That what's a meeting for? Right? So why are we doing this? And let's be really clear on that before we even convene the meeting. So maybe walk us through those questions. I think that would be helpful to our listeners.
Sure. And I think what you've articulated so well at so many points already is, just as many parts of our organization have historically been, cookie cutter, and now we're becoming more dynamic and ought to become more agile, our meetings look largely the same as they did decades and decades ago. And we continue to schedule meetings based on what our calendar tells us should be a meeting. We default to the 30-minute meeting. We default to the weekly cadence. We default to recycling agendas. About 50% of all recurring agendas are recycled from the previous week. And we get in the habit of, going through the motions as opposed to intentionally designing them. So the 4D CEO test is a simple 2-part test to determine whether you need a meeting, whether a meeting deserves to be on the calendar, whether it deserves to exist. And it's fascinating that in so many organizations, there's not that clarity for employees in terms of what deserves to be a meeting. So 4D CEO test, first is the 4D test. A meeting should only happen if the purpose is to decide, debate, discuss, or develop yourself or your team. Even if it passes that first test, it should pass the second test, which is the CEO test. Meetings should only happen if the content is complex. So that's the C. There needs to be enough ambiguity, enough unknown unknowns where it probably is most efficient to make sense of it live synchronously together. E is emotionally intense, right? We know that if we're trying to navigate emotions, read emotions, interpret emotions, well, empathy is so important. Trust, body language, right? Probably that's going to be most effective in person. And then O comes from Amazon. Is it a one-way door decision? Meaning, once we walk through the door, how difficult is it to reverse or correct course? In the case of one-way door decisions, where it is very difficult, if not impossible, to revert course, well, probably a meeting is going to be valuable to ensure that you have that alignment. The cost of misalignment is so high.
Yeah, so let me just elaborate on that a minute for those that haven't heard this idea. So Jeff Bezos used to very famously talk about type 1 and type 2 decisions. And he says, type 1 decisions are very consequential. They're irreversible. It's what you call the one-way door. Once you've gone through them, it's very, very hard to reverse. And oftentimes they have significant implications. Type 2 decisions, on the other hand, are reversible. They're low consequence. They're not going to take the company down if something goes wrong. And if it doesn't work out, you can just turn your back on it and walk through. And one of the things that they talk about a lot at Amazon is, why treat every decision as though it's a type 1 decision, which a lot of companies do. I mean, I've literally been in organizations where the board, the most significant senior level decision-making body, would spend 20 minutes of one of its meetings debating what Easter gifts to give to their most important clients. For goodness sake, that's ridiculous, and yet that had been the practice since the company was a tiny company. And so it just kept on going, which is interesting about organizations because they kind of accumulate these routines, which is one of the reasons I think this meeting doomsday thing is so interesting. Yes,
and I think, it's very fascinating when they accumulate these routines and they intersect with human behavior, because what we also know is meetings and agendas in particular suffer from what's called the law of triviality. Sometimes it's called bike shedding, but the law of triviality, which states that we are more likely to spend more time on the least trivial items on the agenda. And so if you have that Easter gift on the agenda, we're more likely to spend more time on that item because it's cognitively easier than the other cognitively taxing items. Everyone feels safe to weigh in on, in general, you think on what the Easter gift might be, right? There's very low risk associated with it. And so that's, when we think about agenda design, that's one of the key things we should keep in mind, not just, how many things are on the agenda, but what is the level of importance and criticality associated with them? Because if we have a mismatch, well, we're going to default to spend more time on the least trivial, lower risk, lower stakes items, which, probably don't require synchronous, expensive live time.
That's so interesting. And I think you're probably right, because, anybody can weigh in on whether it should be tulips or roses, and we all feel comfortable with that. And there's no real wrong answer in that case. It'll be nice for the customers, whatever comes up. So I'll come back to this because you talk about this in the book quite a bit, which is this idea of decision fatigue. And, this connects to a whole body of research, which shows that things like the ability to cognitively make decisions, the exercise of willpower, the ability to concentrate. These are all things that human beings have in finite supply. And and a lot of companies don't seem to take that into account when they're designing meetings. I remember I was with a big insurance company out in the Midwest, and their entire day, all the executives began at top of the hour, went for 50 minutes, then there was a 10-minute break, and then the next meeting would start at the top of the hour, 50 minutes, 10-minute break. And that's literally how they spent the entire day, with maybe a break for lunch. And I mean, by 4 o'clock, how do you even remember what happened at 9 o'clock?
It's so important. And I see the same thing. And sometimes I'll see the argument, well, wow, we have these 10 minutes. That's enough to recharge and have a bathroom break in between meetings. There's, as you mentioned, there's so much evidence to suggest how important breaks are. One of my favorite studies, I'm sure you're familiar with this, is the Israeli judge study, where they tracked these judges over years and years and whether they granted parole. And what they essentially found is when the parole hearing was happening, if it was at the start of the day or right after a break, the judges were, I think in 66% of cases or something along those lines, they granted parole. But as soon as it became 2 hours, 2 hours had elapsed within the parole hearing after a break or at the start of the day, the likelihood that they would grant parole dropped to nearly zero, right? And I think that, that underscores just how important it is to take these breaks as we're scheduling meetings. Think about, how many meetings have come before, what your, mental state is, and ensure that if that is one of the decision-making type meetings, that we have enough cognitive energy and cognitive capacity to make those decisions effectively for the organization.
Yeah, I think that's so important. One of the other activities that everybody talks about, but nobody actually does, is, Amazon's 6-page memo principle, yes. Which, and again, for those of you that don't know, by the way, my guest this week, for those of you just joining us, is Rebecca Hinds, author of this terrific book, Your Best Meeting Ever, talking about one of the major scourges of the white-collar world, which is, endless meetings that are badly designed and not necessarily fit for purpose. But, one of the things they did at Amazon was they said an awful lot of meetings are just death by PowerPoint. This past week, I've been in a fair number of those. And what Jeff Bezos, again, famously said was, it's just too easy to hide behind a PowerPoint. It's just, the words are on the screen. It all looks gorgeous. It looks polished, but you're not actually taxing people's cognitive challenge. So what they do at Amazon is they write a memo. It can be up to 6 pages long, explaining what it is that's the topic of the meeting. And whoever the author is has to actually sit down and write this thing out. And then when they come together, they spend the first 20 or 25 minutes silently reading these memos. And then if you have questions or comments, you can write them on the sidebar. And then when you actually get into the decision-making meeting, now everybody's got the same information. You all taken the time to actually read it, because nobody reads the pre-reads. And now you can move on with the quality conversation. And it's so funny. I've suggested to so many companies that they adopt something like that, and they just won't do it. It's fascinating to me. Now, why do you suppose that is?
Well, and there's one other, because I researched this practice because I'm also a proponent of it. And the other element that I think is fascinating is once you come together, they call it study hall, where you're reading the pre-read, the memo together collectively. Well, if you've gone through the process of reading and leaving comments and you feel like you have nothing left to add or read from the meeting, you're encouraged to leave right then and there and not sit through the meeting as well. And so that's an example of sometimes called the law of 2 feet, right, where you see in these effective organizations throughout history, they might not call it the law of 2 feet. They might not use the memo in this way, the memo culture in this way, but they have norms around if you're not contributing value to a meeting, you are expected to protect your time, protect everyone else's time, and get up and leave. I think, change is always hard for organizations, and to implement new practices is hard, especially if they're time consuming. And we like to believe in the ideal organization, and the ideal organization being everyone does the homework when they're asked to do the homework. The reality is not the case, and it's hard to change behaviors. And if you don't have that leader like a Bezos at the top of the org chart who is advocating for this practice, it becomes very difficult. And that's why I think metrics are important. And the more we can tie these practices to better meeting design, and I've seen it in organizations where, once you start to gather feedback, once you start to measure ROTI and compare the meetings that have this type of, pre-read culture, memo culture to the ones that don't, all else being equal as much as you can control for, right? You start to see that, yes, if this is done intentionally, it is a very healthy practice that we should be adopting more of in our organizations.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, in the case of Amazon, you can't not do it. And this is an interesting thing, I think, when you think about really effective leaders. One of the things they really do seem to get their arms around is, how do I use meetings? Because if I'm a CEO or if I'm a very senior leader, time, how I spend my time is one of the most significant things. So I often get called into organizations and typically for me, it'll be, oh, really struggling with innovation and growth, and we're not clear on our strategy, and whatever it is. And so I'll say, okay, before we get together, why don't you send me the last 3 meeting agendas where important people got together to talk about important stuff, and I'll take a highlighter pen, and I'll go through the agenda if it's printed out, and if innovation or new business development or growth or any of those topics is sort of item number 18 right next to material safety data sheet update, we've got a problem. Because one of the things I've said for years to CEOs is, if you really mean it, whatever it is, whether it's quality, whether it's innovation, whether it's global growth, whatever the thing is that you really think is important, I want to see it in slot 1, 2, or 3 on every meeting agenda. Every time you meet somebody in the hallway, they know you're going to ask them about it. When you're having informal conversations, when you're having town halls, it's always there. It's always present. It's how you spend your time. And the same with your calendar, right? If your calendar's jammed up with all kinds of stuff that doesn't have any coherence to it, you're never going to get the organization to pay attention, because they're going to look at it and go, I could just skate by. There's no prioritization here, right?
And one of the other strategies I talk about in the book is how to frame those agenda items, right? Because often it is just a bullet point around innovation or team discussion, very, very vague types of agenda items. And I think one of the best tests for, are you really walking the talk, is how specific are those agenda items, either listed or as you go through and talk, right? Is it all talk, or are we being concrete in terms of what we're doing or what we're trying to achieve? So one of the tests I look at is the first word in an agenda item a verb? Right? Because that tells a lot about whether, how action oriented the discussion is going to be and is set up to be, versus just a noun, just team discussion versus a line on the budget, right? What exactly are you trying to do in the meeting? And I think that's a helpful, what specifically about innovation are you discussing? Are you trying to move forward? Or is it just the vague phrase where, we can do a lot of talking about it, but are we going to action it as the next step?
Oh, I love that. So, and I mean, that's something simple. That's not expensive. You could do that this afternoon if somebody wanted to. So start with a line on something, or decide on X, or, I love that. So put a verb in.
Prioritize.
I love that. What a great idea. So that's something all of you can take away. Those of you that are listening to this, think about meeting topics in terms of verbs. What is it that the outcome is going to be from this? I love that. One of my favorite examples of a leader who just brilliantly used meetings was Alan Mulally when he came into Ford. And I don't know if you know this story, but when he came into Ford, he'd been recruited from Boeing. So he was a complete outsider, not just to the company, but to the industry, and everybody in Detroit thought this was wacko. Why are you inviting this airline guy to come into the automobile industry? And Alan wasn't bothered by this. He says, Boeing 777 has 4 million moving parts and it flies. I think I can handle cars. But what he would do is every week he had what he called his business plan review meeting. And the principle of it was very simple, that every week there was your agenda for what you were supposed to accomplish according to your plan that week. And all the items were color coded, right? So green was, I'm on track, I'm in good shape. Yellow was, well, I've got some problems, but I think I know what to do with them. And the red was, I've got an issue and I don't know what to do with it. So when Alan came into Ford, the culture he walked into was just famously, and we're not talking out of school, this was publicly very well documented, the culture was internally incredibly combative. So the enemy was not General Motors. The enemy was the guy down the hall that you were competing with to get the next raise or promotion. And everybody said at the time, I don't have time to come to your meetings. And Alan, he's great. He's always smiling, very positive. He says, oh, that's fine. That's okay. And Alan's the kind of guy, like when he says that's okay, the little hairs on the back of your neck should start to go up. He's like, well, you can't be a member of the leadership team at the Ford Motor Company if you don't come to my meeting, but it doesn't mean you're a bad person. So of course, the first meeting, they're all sitting there. Everybody but him doesn't want to be there, right? They've never been forced to work as one Ford, as one team before. They've always been sort of rewarded for running their different pieces of the organization. And So at that time, Ford was on track to lose $17 billion. I mean, that's a lot of money, even for a company the size of Ford. And they were going to go bankrupt if drastic change didn't happen. And of course, they get into the first meeting and everybody has their sheets in front of them, which again, they didn't want to do. And it's all green. And Alan looks at them and he says, is it our plan to lose $17 billion? Because if it is, we're doing great. And then I took about 3 or 4 meetings, and then finally Mark Fields got up and he said, well, I think to have one of those red things, you keep going on about, I'm red on edge. And the whole room goes completely quiet. And they're all like, all right, is Mark, going to be leaving the door and not, leaving the room through the side door and not in a good way? And Alan gets up and he claps. He says, great transparency, Mark. Let's stop the meeting. Let's go around. Does anybody have any ideas? And this to me is where the magic was, because when they were invited to give their ideas, some guy in Europe had a similar manufacturing problem, had 2 engineers. He volunteered to fly over to Mark's operation and help him fix what the technical issue was. Another person had a great idea about what to do about the dealers. And. I mean, they had about probably 70 to 80% of the solution orchestrated in, 10 minutes or less. So to me, that's just a iconic perspective on how you can actually use meetings to drive action. And it's just so different from most of what most corporate meetings have been part of our life.
Yes, I love that example, and it underscores the importance of leadership. And we've seen this with great leaders throughout history. They'll create cultures of psychological safety where that is the magic of a meeting. Those are the best meetings in terms of the most productive, because you are soliciting that raw feedback, the hard conversations, the learning opportunities in a collective way. And it takes the leader to create that environment, or else, you'll see all the status updates come in bright green, as opposed to having those hard conversations around, okay, how can we learn and improve together collectively?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that. So take us through your arguments about in-person versus hybrid meetings, because that's like one of the great topics of our time. And I mean, we have to have hybrid meetings. They're, not everybody's going to be all together in the same place all the time. It's just a fact of life. But at the same time, most hybrid meetings are even worse than the in-person ones.
Yes, and the remote ones, because it becomes very difficult. And I've done quite a bit of research on status dynamics in distributed organizations, and we know by default the people in the room have higher status than the people on the Zoom call, right? They have proximity bias, they have the side conversations, right? They're privy to much more information being in the room collectively together. And that's why hybrid meetings can be so difficult, because you have people on level playing fields. I often liken it to shifting the center of gravity, right? The more we can shift the center of gravity away from the physical co-located room to the people on the Zoom screen or the people dialing in remotely, well, the more we're going to create the conditions for a more effective meeting. There are lots of strategies we can think about, everything from inviting the remote folks to speak first, right? Because you're counteracting that primacy effect that happens in the room, where often the people in the room dominate the conversation. Well, if you start by inviting the remote folks, you're shifting that gravity a little bit towards the remote folks. I love to have some physical representation of the remote folks in the room. Mm-hmm. So whether that's a note card, or there was a fascinating study done in China where they used robots that had, this is bizarre, but robots that had a balloon coming from their nose that looked like a snot bubble, and the snot bubble would expand the more time elapsed after the the more the in-person folks spoke, the more time that had elapsed where the remote folks had not spoken, the snot bubble would get bigger and bigger as a representation of the need to bring people into the conversation, and those types of signals in the room, because we get into meetings, we get into the physical environment, and it's natural that we don't always appreciate the people who are on especially if they have their cameras off, right? And so the more we can create those physical environments, note cards, empty chairs. Amazon was another a famous company that used the empty chair to represent the customer. The idea that we should always be representing the customer voice in meetings. Well, I think we can do the same thing for remote folks.
Mm-hmm.
Documentation is really important. Ensuring that we're actually inviting the remote folks to the meeting, which is not always the case. But it's hard. It's hard to design hybrid work meetings. And that's, again, why measurement becomes important. We should be understanding and soliciting feedback from the remote folks as to, how can we better design this meeting? I've seen buddy systems in place as well, where you pair remote folks with in-person folks, and the in-person folks are meant to be soliciting the ideas and bringing the remote folks into the conversation if they're not heavily involved. Those types of strategies, I think, can be effective. But hybrid, meetings, all else being equal, if you can have everyone in person, that is best in many cases, but it's not always feasible. And we also need to weigh the trade-offs between, the logistics of bringing everyone together and the relative importance of the meeting and what we're trying to achieve in it.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about some companies have deliberately declared themselves to be, primarily remote. So Atlassian comes to mind, where they'll take people who are working asynchronously, something like 10 to 11 months of the year. But then what they very deliberately do, and I guess because they are remote, they can sort of track, who connects with who talks to who's out of the loop, who's part of the networks, who's not. And they can, in a positive way, track all that. So that when they do, with that final month, what they do is they get together in these ginormous meetings, but they deliberately plan them so that people who are not necessarily connecting with each other in the kind of remote space are put together on teams that are made to work together on something. And so they really, really aim for that bonding that can only happen really in person, while they work asynchronously the rest of the time. So I think there are ways to finesse this, but it requires design, as you say. I mean, it doesn't just happen. It's not a natural act.
Certainly.
Human beings, we're all huddled around the campfire based on our ancestral inheritance.
Exactly. And Atlassian has also done fascinating research to show how sticky that in-person bonding is. Often we think that if we're in distributed team environments, or, moreover, if we're in in-person team environments, we need to be getting together every day, every week, every month. Well, them and others have done research to show, Pam Hinds is one at Stanford who's done great research on this as well. If we are intentional about designing the in-person moments, well, they can last. That connection, that bonding, that rapport, that trust can last for months and months. And so if we're really intentional, we can think about, okay, how do we truly design those moments of togetherness, physically, synchronously, so that we, capitalize on the months and months ahead, where we no longer have the luxury of face-to-face conversations, but we still need to move work forward and work together effectively.
I really like that. That's fun. So do you suggest, for example, if there's a requirement for some people to be remote, is it better for everybody to be remote so we're all on an equal playing field?
This is where I think it depends context to context, because, we know that the more a meeting passes that 4D CEO test, right, the more emotional intensity in particular there is in the meeting. You're trying to persuade someone, you're building rapport. We do know that those things happen better in person. And so I think it has to be meeting to meeting specific. I certainly see cases where everyone having their laptop dialing in remotely is the right way to go. But I think if we have the luxury of in-person interactions, sometimes, we should be biasing toward that as opposed to the equal footing of everyone in the room.
So you give up a lot when you go all remote.
You give up on the rich media. In some cases, you gain so much. You gain, flexibility, and you gain, the logistical convenience. But you do give up the rich medium of communication. We know that in general, not always, but in general, trust is easier to establish face to face. Rapport, relationships tend to be as well. So that's what you tend to give up.
Mm-hmm. So one of the topics that comes up all the time is how do we deal with making sure that we get diverse perspectives heard? So, there's a very, very robust body of research which shows that if you're in the minority, so that could be, a man in a group of all women, or a person of color in a group of all white people, or a white person in a group of all black people, whoever's in the minority tends to have a couple of disadvantages. So the first one is that they tend to have a narrower range of acceptable behavior. So if I just take the research that's been done on women, if we're warm and approachable and friendly, we're lightweights. And if we're demanding and, candid and sort of giving brutal feedback, we're things that I probably shouldn't say on a family-oriented podcast, but it's like, whereas a man does the same thing, and if they're warm and approachable, they're really likable and they're genuine and authentic. And if a man's really demanding and a tough taskmaster, but he's really on, he's really pulling the team forward. So that's one big problem. And then the other big problem is that those people find it very difficult, literally, to be heard. They'll say something and it gets skated right over. And then somebody 5 minutes later will say exactly the same thing who's in the majority group and get heard. So are there tips you can give us for the design of meetings to make sure we get the best out of them? Because, another very robust research finding is that, and this I'm drawing here on the work of Kathy Phillips, who found out years ago. And the problem with human outcomes, for the most part, is you can't design an experiment, right? In real life, you'd see, you can't know what would have happened if you behaved differently, because we can't go back and run the tape and all that. But what Kathy could do is she would assign groups these creative problem-solving tasks, and because she did it in a lab environment, you could actually tell who did better or not, and you could set up the control group and the test group and so forth. And what she found is, when assigned a creative problem-solving task, I think this research is fascinating, that the homogenous groups felt great about what they'd done. They finished early. They all agreed this was awesome. This was just an amazing experience. We had such a good time. And the diverse groups were like, this was so hard. It took us 15 minutes to even figure out what the other person was saying. It was really a challenge. And here's the kicker. When you look at how well they did on the task, the homogenous groups vastly underperformed the diverse groups. And Kathy's hypothesis at the time was that having to wrestle with real diversity and having to work together with people who are not like you triggers this part of our brain that is actually associated with creative problem solving. It forces us to think more. And, our brains are lazy. I mean, we'll take the easy route out every time if we can. And that's just the way we're programmed, because brain power is expensive, and calories used to be really hard to come by. So we're trained, we're built to minimize the stress on our thinking capacity. So what guidance might you have for getting those voices heard?
So there are a few different tips, and I think getting the voices heard is sometimes different than ensuring that you're bringing together diverse opinions. And I'll sort of give examples, but ideally you have the leader who is, actively soliciting these diverse opinions, making sure everyone in the room has a voice and is contributing to the meeting. That's sort of, baseline what we should hope for in a meeting. There's a lot of great research on brainstorming and what makes brainstorming most effective. And the research is, pretty overwhelming that if we brainstorm independently first, sometimes it's called brain writing, before we come together and brainstorm synchronously, well, we're significantly more likely to not only generate more ideas, but higher quality ideas, because you're minimizing some of that groupthink of being biased by the most powerful or most influential person in the room. So I think that could be a very healthy practice. Ideally, people are sharing live once they brainstormed independently. But even in the case of anonymous submissions, you can imagine a world where if there isn't this safe space, well, after we've brain written and developed ideas independently, there is some feedback mechanism or form where people can submit their ideas anonymously and have them brought forward in the conversation. But I'm a big proponent of brain writing as opposed to right out of the gate brainstorming collectively, because we know a host of different biases start to kick in. What is so fascinating is we're starting to see more and more evidence of AI and technology being very helpful in this regard. One of my favorite studies over the past few years came out of a group from Stanford and Berkeley, who I know quite well, and they measured what they called discursive diversity in groups, which is essentially as teams and groups were collaborating and communicating, how diverse was the language they were using, right? How diverse were the perspectives they were sharing, the words they were using. And what they found is the highest performing teams, they actually flex their levels of discursive diversity depending on the task at hand. So when they needed to be creative and when they needed to generate, new and novel ideas, their discursive diversity increased, right? And that is intuitive because we want to bring together different perspectives and viewpoints. But then when they were at the point where they were coordinating, planning, moving work forward, their discursive diversity dropped because they needed to align on next steps, and their words sort of reflected that, the differences in the words and phrases and perspectives. And so you're starting to see, meeting companies, meeting tools, think about, okay, how might we nudge teams in the right collaborative mode. We can all do this right now, upload a meeting transcript to an AI tool with consent and ask it, did we converge too quickly? Did we not explore enough diversity of opinions, or did we stay divergent too long and fail to align on next steps? There's fascinating research on the role of AI as a devil's advocate, and early research to show that just hearing an objective AI say something like, have you considered other opinions, is enough to dislodge that groupthink and leave people more satisfied with the outcome of the meeting. In that case, AI, in theory, doesn't even need to be right to be useful in encouraging us to think broader. Now, that doesn't answer the question of how do you ensure voices are heard within the meeting, but there are ways, I think, at the intersection of technology and meeting design where we can think much more deliberately, intentionally, and in an evidence-based way in terms of how do we ensure that diverse, different opinions and perspectives and voices are heard and represented in the meeting. And that's one of my, that's one of the things I'm most excited about when it comes to AI is the opportunity to inject more diversity into our meetings and communication and collaboration generally.
Yeah, I like that a lot. There's one study I recall that was measuring, I guess it was a measure of creativity where you'll do something like, I don't know, give people a paper clip and say, what are all the things you can do with this paper clip? And, humans will come up with, well, you could hang a picture with it. You could unwind it and use it to tie vegetables together. You could do whatever. And, we sort of peter out somewhere between 40 and 50 ideas, right? But you give the same problem to an AI and it can go on for hundreds of ideas. Now, most of them will be completely absurd and not very useful, but you'll generate more of them. And so if you're in a mode where the quantity of ideas matters, and in most creative endeavors, what you're interested is not so much the medium cases, right? You're interested in the edge cases. So the more weird stuff you can come up with, the more likely you are to come up with something that's truly original. But, there's a lot of dumb stuff you have to get through to get there. So I think that's another way in which AI can actually help us come up with divergent perspectives, come up with divergent ideas. So since the book was published, has there been anything that surprised you in terms of people's reactions or what people took to or comments people have made?
My favorite are the practical, what did you do to improve meetings, and things that I certainly have didn't cover in the book, certainly hadn't thought about when I wrote the book, especially around AI and, some of the leading companies right now in AI using the technology to fundamentally rethink how they design meetings, auto nudges, auto deletions when meetings don't pass a certain threshold of good meeting design. I'm working with one of the largest ride sharing companies, and they've taken the ROTI measurement system and automated it in terms of now through their calendaring meeting system, they're prompting employees to rate the meetings. They're giving meeting organizers that feedback. They're looking at a whole host of different, telemetry signals multitasking, whether people show up at the start of the meeting or whether they trickle in 5 minutes late, and starting to give recommendations in terms of, okay, how might you design this meeting to be more effective for the people in the room? Or, in some cases, this meeting has outlived its purpose, its usefulness, consider deleting it. I think that becomes very exciting because, as we've discussed, meetings are so personal. There's so much human bias and human judgment involved in meetings, where we often feel this sense of guilt associated with pushing back on the meeting or canceling it. Well, if you can offload some of that guilt to the technology, then that takes some of the onus off of the human to push back and push for the design of better meetings.
Well, and that also eliminates some of the power dynamics, right? Because if a very important person invites you to the meeting and you're like, oh, I really, the last three of those I've gone to have been a complete waste of time. If it's a powerful person, you kind of don't want to say no. But if the machine says, no, this is our recommendation. I love that idea. That's so clever. So is there I don't know how to put this, but I often wonder, if you were to sort of say, in my week, right, I'm going to have a meeting budget of hours. There's just only going to be so many hours that I'm going to allow to be consumed by meetings. Is there kind of an optimal time for that? Because honestly, I mean, I have weeks, and I'm sure you do too, where like every minute's spoken for. And so you end up actually doing your work like in the evenings or weekends, and that's not healthy.
So we've actually started to build, because there's certainly a threshold, and there's great research. There's a company, Worklytics, who I've done work with over the years, and what they've essentially found is a whole host of negative effects start to kick in once you're in more than 10 hours a week of meetings. Now, most people are in well over 10 hours a week, but I think, thinking about that threshold can be useful, especially if you're an individual contributor. But, what I do believe strongly in is, again, the power of artificial intelligence to help us make this determination. And we've started to develop, calculator type instruments where if AI knows enough about you, your role within the organization, the extent to which you need to lead people versus are responsible for heads down work, the extent to which you get energized by people, right? There are this very complex calculus that the AI can take into account to help you determine, okay, what is the right meeting budget for my specific work. There's a story in the book where it's the CEO of Zapier, who I'm a big fan of as well, where he makes the point of, we should all be looking at our calendars and at the same time write down what we think are our priorities, right? If you were to write down right now, what are your priorities and what percentage of your time should you spend on each priority, interacting with customers, strategy thinking, and then look at your calendar and do those two things match up, right? For very few people do those two things match up. Well, if AI can understands enough about your work, your priorities, your organization's priorities, well, it can start to nudge you in the right direction in terms of, wow, you're spending way too much time in these meetings that aren't contributing to your priorities. Consider, readjusting your schedule in that way. Most organizations are nowhere near this point, but I am starting to see organizations think in this direction and work with them to think in this direction. And it becomes very exciting because, again, it removes some of the cognitively difficult work of determining what should be on our calendar and allows us to be much more data-driven and strategic about, are we investing our time in the things that are going to be most conducive and most beneficial to helping us and our organizations and teams reach our objectives.
I love that. And, I think it's going to be increasingly important because what we're seeing now is across the board, especially in knowledge-based / digital fields, the unit of value creation are small teams. And I know in the book you say no more than 8, like in a meeting, right? So keep it small. But small teams and even individuals are now become the unit of value creation. So you can conceive of organizational forms, and maybe Atlassian's like this, maybe Zapier's like this, where it's actually more like little constellations of teams that interact with each other. So to get stuff done, you're going to have to coordinate with others, which implies in many cases meetings, but it also means getting better at those meetings is crucial, because otherwise you're not going to get the work done that you're supposedly working together to accomplish. So
Yes.
I think this is such a critical topic. Well, Rebecca, this has just flown. For those of you that joined us late, my guest this week is Rebecca Hinds, author of a terrific book, Your Best Meeting Ever, which I could highly recommend for those of us cubicle dwellers who spend a lot of our time in meetings. So where do people learn more? How can they get smarter about this stuff?
So the book is everywhere at your favorite bookstore. My website's RebeccaHinds.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I run the Work AI Institute at Glean, which is the Work AI platform. So we have a bunch of more AI focused research at workai.institute. We just published a report a few weeks ago that I think is resonating with a lot of people. The gist of it is there's so much manual labor required to make this technology usable. How do we redesign our organizations and our structure to make sure that the technology is helping us? It's not adding more work. It's not adding more meetings onto our calendar.
I love that. So some just super practical ideas, not try to make it not more than 10 hours a week, verbs in your meeting agendas, the 4Ds for what's a meeting for. I mean, just so many practical things people can put to work immediately. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has really been a pleasure and very informative.
Thank you so much for having me, Rita.
Thanks.